In 1919, a black woman inherited something that shouldn't exist in Jim Crow America, a 34-room mansion designed by the nation's first registered black architect, millions of dollars in liquid assets, and perhaps most dangerous of all, the audacity to live as if the color line didn't apply to her. Her name was A'Lelia Walker, and for reasons both deliberate and insidious, history has worked remarkably hard to forget her. This is not a story about a woman who simply had money. This is about a black woman who inherited the lifestyle, the privileges and the social power that white supremacy had constructed exclusively for itself, and then used that inheritance to build something white America never anticipated, a cultural empire that celebrated blackness at the precise moment when the nation was trying to legislate it into invisibility. Villa Lewaro still stands in Irvington, New York, though few people who pass it understand what it represents. The mansion's limestone facade, its manicured grounds, its architectural grandeur, all of it whispers a question that made white neighbors uncomfortable in the 1920s and still unsettles our historical narratives today. What happens when a black woman lives like American royalty? The answer to that question begins not with A'Lelia, but with her mother, a woman who transformed herself from the daughter of enslaved parents into the wealthiest self-made woman in America, of any race. Sarah Breedlove was born in 1867 on a Louisiana plantation, the first member of her family born into freedom. Her parents, Owen and Minerva Breedlove, had been enslaved on the same plantation where Sarah was born, and they remained there after emancipation, working as sharecroppers in conditions that differed from slavery, more in legal status than in practical reality. Sarah was orphaned by age 7, her parents victims of the yellow fever epidemic that swept through the South in the 1870s. She went to live with her older sister Louvenia and brother-in-law, working in cotton fields and experiencing the brutal poverty that defined life for most formerly enslaved people in the Reconstruction South. At 14, Sarah married Moses McWilliams, partly to escape her brother-in-law's abuse. She gave birth to her daughter Lelia in 1885, and 2 years later Moses died, the circumstances unclear, but possibly a victim of racial violence, a common fate for black men in the post-Reconstruction South. Sarah was a widow at 20, with a young daughter to support and almost no resources. She moved to St. Louis where her brothers worked as barbers, and found work as a washerwoman, one of the few jobs available to black women. For nearly 2 decades, she scrubbed other people's clothes, earning barely enough to survive. But during these years, she was also observing, learning, and developing the business acumen that would eventually make her fortune. Sarah suffered from a scalp ailment that caused her to lose her hair, a common problem for black women at the time. The combination of poor nutrition, stress, and harsh hair treatments led to scalp diseases and hair loss for many black women. The available products, mostly made by white-owned companies, weren't designed for black hair and often made the problems worse. Sarah began experimenting with home remedies and products, eventually developing her own formula. She later claimed that the formula came to her in a dream, a story that was part marketing genius and part genuine spiritual belief. What mattered was that her products worked. They addressed the specific needs of black women's hair and scalp, and they were sold by a black woman who understood her customers' experiences. In 1905, Sarah moved to Denver and married Charles Joseph Walker, a newspaper sales agent who understood marketing and promotion. She became Madam C.J. Walker, a name that sounded more professional and memorable than Sarah McWilliams. The Madam gave her an air of European sophistication, while C.J. Walker sounded businesslike and authoritative. Madam Walker didn't just sell products, she built a system. She recruited and trained black women to become Walker agents, teaching them not just how to sell the products, but how to present themselves professionally, how to manage money, and how to build their own small businesses. These women, many of them former domestic workers or laundresses, found in the Walker system an opportunity for economic independence that was revolutionary for its time. By 1910, Madam Walker had moved her business to Indianapolis, where she built a factory and training school. The Walker Company employed thousands of people directly and created economic opportunities for tens of thousands more through its agent network. Madam Walker became not just wealthy but influential, using her platform to speak about black economic empowerment, women's rights, and anti-lynching activism. The products Madam Walker developed and sold weren't simply commercial goods. They were part of a larger conversation about black beauty, black self-determination, and black economic power. In an era when the dominant culture insisted that black features were inherently inferior, when popular culture depicted black people as ugly caricatures, when the beauty industry existed exclusively for white women, Madam Walker created a business that said, "Your hair deserves care, attention, and quality products designed specifically for you." Her business model was revolutionary. She didn't just sell products. She created economic opportunities for thousands of black women who became Walker agents, selling door to door and earning income that gave them independence their mothers could never have imagined. These women, many of them formerly enslaved or daughters of enslaved people, became entrepreneurs themselves, building small businesses within the larger Walker empire. The Walker agents became a visible presence in black communities across the country. They were well-dressed, professional, and economically independent, a stark contrast to the domestic workers and laundresses that most people expected black women to be. They represented a new possibility, a vision of black womanhood that combined business success with community service and racial pride. By 1916, Madam Walker had accumulated enough wealth to commission something unprecedented, a mansion that would rival anything owned by white industrialists. She hired Vertner Tandy, who in 1908 had become the first African-American registered architect in New York State, to design a residence that would make an unmistakable statement. Tandy himself was a groundbreaking figure. He had studied at Cornell University and Tuskegee Institute, and he co-founded Alpha Phi Alpha, the first intercollegiate Greek letter fraternity for African Americans. The result of their collaboration was Villa Lewaro, a 34-room Italian Renaissance-style mansion with gold-plated fixtures, a pipe organ that cost $7,000, an indoor swimming pool lined with marble, and gardens that stretched across 4 acres of prime real estate in Westchester County. The mansion had a music room, a library, multiple parlors and bedrooms for family and guests. The attention to detail was extraordinary. Imported Italian marble, hand-carved woodwork, crystal chandeliers, and furnishings that rivaled those in the homes of the Rockefellers and Vanderbilts. The construction of Villa Lewaro cost approximately $250,000, an astronomical sum in 1916, equivalent to several million dollars today. But the real cost, the one that couldn't be measured in dollars, was the audacity of a black woman claiming space in a white neighborhood, building a mansion that announced her arrival in terms that couldn't be ignored or dismissed. The name itself tells a story. When the famous Italian tenor Enrico Caruso visited the mansion, he suggested naming it by combining the first 2 letters of each part of Lelia Walker's name, Lela Waro, which became Lewaro. That a white European opera star would participate in naming a black woman's palace says something about the unique space Madam Walker had carved out for herself and her family. She had become wealthy enough, influential enough, that even white celebrities treated her with respect, or at least with the appearance of respect. But there was always a tension at the heart of the Walker empire, a contradiction that critics then and historians now have struggled to reconcile. Many of the Walker Company's most popular products were hair straightening treatments. The Walker system involved washing the hair with specific products, applying a pomade, and then using heated metal combs to straighten the hair. Were these tools of assimilation, products that told black women their natural hair wasn't acceptable? Or were they instruments of choice, giving black women control over their own appearance in a society that policed black bodies relentlessly? Madam Walker herself rejected the term hair straightener, insisting her products were about hair health and grooming, not about making black women look white. She pointed out that white women also used heated styling tools and chemical treatments to achieve their desired looks. Why should black women be denied the same options? Why should black women's hair care choices be politicized in ways that white women's choices never were? But the question lingered, and it would follow her daughter throughout her life. Can you build black economic power by selling products that seem to accommodate white beauty standards? Is it possible to celebrate black beauty while also offering products that alter black features? These questions didn't have simple answers in the 1910s, and they still don't have simple answers today. This was the complex inheritance that Lelia McWilliams, who would transform herself into a Lelia Walker, received when her mother died in May 1919. She didn't just inherit money. She inherited a business empire that employed thousands of people and served hundreds of thousands of customers. She inherited Villa Lewaro, a mansion that was both a symbol of achievement and a target for resentment. She inherited her mother's reputation as a racewoman, a leader who was expected to use her wealth and influence for the betterment of all black people. And she inherited an impossible set of expectations about what a wealthy black woman should do with her power. A'Lelia was born in 1885 in Vicksburg, Mississippi, during the years when her mother was still Sarah Breedlove, still struggling, still years away from the fortune that would define their lives. Her early childhood was marked by poverty and instability. Her father, Moses McWilliams, died when she was 2 years old, and her mother struggled to support them both through domestic work. She grew up watching her mother build something from nothing, watching her navigate a business world that didn't believe black women belonged in it, watching her accumulate wealth that white society insisted was impossible. This education, watching her mother's determination, her business acumen, her refusal to accept the limitations that society tried to impose, shaped A'Lelia's understanding of what was possible for a black woman in America. She received an education that was rare for black women of her generation, attending Knoxville College in Tennessee, a historically black institution founded after the Civil War to educate formerly enslaved people and their children. At Knoxville, A'Lelia studied literature, music, and the arts, subjects that would shape her later interests and activities. She was exposed to black intellectuals and educators who believed in the power of education to transform individual lives and advance the race as a whole. From adolescence, she was trained in the family business, learning not just how to sell products but how to manage operations, handle finances, and present herself as the face of black female entrepreneurship. Her mother took her on business trips, introduced her to important contacts, and gradually prepared her to take over the company. But even as A'Lelia learned the business, it was clear that her interests lay elsewhere. She loved the arts, loved socializing, loved creating beautiful environments and bringing interesting people together. She had inherited her mother's business acumen, but what she really wanted to build was something her mother had never had time for: a world where black artists, intellectuals, and creators could flourish without constantly justifying their existence to white gatekeepers. When her mother died on May 25, 1919, at the age of 51, A'Lelia became president of the Madam C.J. Walker Manufacturing Company. She was 34 years old, and she was suddenly responsible for a business empire that employed thousands and served hundreds of thousands of black women across the country. The company had factories, training schools, a network of agents, and a reputation that extended far beyond the black community. But A'Lelia's interests lay elsewhere. She had inherited her mother's business acumen, but what she really wanted to build was something her mother had never had time for: a world where black artists, intellectuals, and creators could flourish without constantly justifying their existence to white gatekeepers. A'Lelia's personal life defied every convention that early 20th century America tried to impose on black women. She married multiple times. Her marriages to John Robinson, Wiley Wilson, and James Kennedy all ended in divorce or separation. Her first marriage to John Robinson occurred when she was still quite young, and it dissolved relatively quickly. Her second marriage to Wiley Wilson, a doctor, lasted longer but also ended in divorce. Her third marriage to James Kennedy was brief and tumultuous. These multiple marriages were scandalous in an era when divorce was rare and socially stigmatized, especially for women. For a black woman in the public eye, someone who was supposed to represent racial progress and respectability, A'Lelia's marital history was particularly controversial. Black leaders and newspapers often criticized her, suggesting that her personal life reflected poorly on the race and undermined the work her mother had done to prove black people's worthiness of respect. She had no biological children, though she adopted her mother's great-niece, May Walker, ensuring the family name would continue. May became A'Lelia's heir, though their relationship was complicated by the pressures of wealth, expectations, and the challenge of living up to the Walker legacy. But it was her lifestyle, not her marriages, that made her a figure of fascination and controversy. She dressed in haute couture from Paris fashion houses, wearing designs by Paul Poiret and other leading designers of the era. She traveled to Europe regularly, visiting Paris, London, and Rome, moving through these cities with the confidence of someone who belonged everywhere. She collected art, both European masterworks and African sculptures, at a time when most Americans didn't consider African art worthy of serious collection. She hosted parties that mixed high society with bohemian artists in ways that made both groups uncomfortable. At A'Lelia's gatherings, a European countess might find herself in conversation with a jazz musician from New Orleans. A Harlem poet might debate with a white philanthropist. A visual artist might perform alongside a classically trained opera singer. These mixtures of class, race, and cultural background were unusual in the highly segregated world of the 1920s, and they made Alelia's events both exciting and slightly dangerous. She lived openly and unapologetically, refusing to perform the respectability that white America demanded and that some black leaders insisted was necessary for racial progress. She smoked cigarettes in public, drank alcohol during Prohibition, wore bold makeup and jewelry, and generally conducted herself in ways that challenged both white expectations of how black people should behave and black middle-class ideas about proper feminine conduct. There were also persistent rumors about Alelia's sexuality. Some contemporaries suggested that she had romantic relationships with women as well as men, though in the coded language of the era, these suggestions were never made explicitly. Whether these rumors were true, or simply the result of her unconventional lifestyle and her close friendships with other women, they added another layer of scandal to her public image. In the late 1910s, as the Great Migration brought hundreds of thousands of black Southerners to northern cities, Alelia made a decision that would define her legacy. She moved to Harlem, purchasing a townhouse at 108-110 West 136th Street that would become one of the most famous addresses in Black America. Harlem in the 1920s was undergoing a transformation that would reshape American culture. The neighborhood was becoming the black capital of America, a place where black people were creating new forms of art, music, literature, and intellectual thought that challenged everything white America believed about black capability and black humanity. The Great Migration had brought black people from the rural South to northern cities, and many of them settled in Harlem. The neighborhood's population exploded, growing from fewer than 100,000 residents in 1910 to over 200,000 by 1930. This demographic shift transformed Harlem from a predominantly white neighborhood into a black metropolis, a city within a city where black people could create their own institutions, businesses, and cultural expressions. This was the Harlem Renaissance, though the people living through it didn't call it that yet. They were simply creating, writing, performing, arguing, and building a cultural movement that would influence American art for generations. The term Harlem Renaissance was applied later by historians looking back at the explosion of black creativity that occurred in the neighborhood during the 1920s and early 1930s. The movement encompassed literature, visual arts, music, theater, and intellectual thought. Writers like Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, Countee Cullen, Claude McKay, and Jean Toomer were producing poetry and prose that explored black life with unprecedented honesty and artistic sophistication. Visual artists like Aaron Douglas and Augusta Savage were creating work that drew on African artistic traditions while engaging with modernist techniques. Musicians were developing jazz and blues into art forms that would transform American music. Intellectuals like W.E.B. Du Bois, Alain Locke, and James Weldon Johnson were theorizing about black identity, culture, and political strategy. And at the center of this explosion of creativity was Alelia Walker, who transformed her inherited wealth into something the Harlem Renaissance desperately needed: space. Alelia maintained both Villa Lawaro in Westchester and her luxurious townhouse at 108-110 West 136th Street in Harlem. Both became legendary for the parties she hosted, extravagant affairs that brought together people who would never otherwise occupy the same room. Her Harlem townhouse was particularly important because it was located in the heart of the neighborhood, easily accessible to the artists and intellectuals who were creating the Renaissance. At Alelia's gatherings, you might find Langston Hughes discussing poetry with Carl Van Vechten, a white writer and photographer who was fascinated by black culture and became a controversial figure in the Harlem Renaissance. Zora Neale Hurston might be telling stories alongside a European aristocrat who had come to Harlem seeking the exotic and the authentic. Countee Cullen might be debating with W.E.B. Du Bois about the purpose of black art while a jazz band played in the next room, and dancers demonstrated the latest steps from the Cotton Club. These weren't just parties. They were radical acts of spatial integration and cultural validation. Alelia created environments where black artists were centered, celebrated, and supported, not as curiosities or tokens, but as the main event. White guests were welcome, but they came into black spaces on black terms. A reversal of the usual power dynamics that was both thrilling and unsettling for everyone involved. The presence of white guests at Alelia's parties was itself controversial. Some black intellectuals criticized her for allowing white people into black cultural spaces, arguing that this compromised the authenticity of black expression and turned black culture into a spectacle for white consumption. The Cotton Club, Harlem's most famous nightclub, exemplified this problem. It featured black performers but only allowed white patrons, turning black artistry into entertainment for white audiences who came to Harlem seeking exotic thrills. Alelia's gatherings were different. White guests attended, but they didn't control the space or set the terms of interaction. Black artists and intellectuals were the hosts, the stars, the people whose opinions and creations mattered most. White patrons who attended Alelia's parties often provided financial support for black artists, commissioning work or providing stipends that allowed artists to focus on their creative work rather than survival jobs. This patronage relationship was complicated and often problematic. White patrons sometimes had their own agendas, wanting black artists to create work that confirmed their expectations or fit their aesthetic preferences. Charlotte Osgood Mason, a wealthy white patron who supported Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston, insisted on being called godmother and exercised significant control over the artists she supported, even dictating what subjects they should write about. Alelia's patronage was different. She didn't try to control the artists she supported or dictate what they should create. She simply provided space, food, drinks, and an environment where artists could gather, share work, and build community. This hands-off approach was both her strength and the reason some people dismissed her as not a serious patron. She facilitated rather than directed. She created conditions rather than outcomes. Langston Hughes, who became one of the most important poets of the 20th century, called Alelia the joy goddess of Harlem's 1920s. He understood what she was doing, even if others dismissed her as a wealthy dilettante who threw good parties but didn't create anything herself. In his autobiography, Hughes wrote affectionately about Alelia's parties, describing the mix of people, the abundance of food and drink, and the sense of possibility that filled her townhouse. Hughes also noted Alelia's generosity. She provided financial support to artists who were struggling, often quietly and without seeking recognition. She paid rent for artists who were facing eviction, bought paintings from visual artists who needed money, and provided meals for writers who were going hungry. This practical support was less visible than her famous parties, but it was equally important to the artists who benefited from it. In 1926, Alelia opened the Dark Tower, a literary salon on the first floor of her Harlem townhouse. The name came from County Cullen's column in Opportunity magazine, one of the leading publications of the Harlem Renaissance. The space was designed specifically for black writers, artists, and intellectuals, a place where they could gather without the presence of white patrons or the pressure to perform for white audiences. The walls of the Dark Tower were decorated with lines from Cullen's poetry, painted directly onto the walls in elegant script. African sculptures and masks were displayed alongside modern art, creating a visual environment that celebrated both African heritage and contemporary black creativity. The furniture was comfortable and elegant, the lighting was warm and inviting, and there was always food and drinks available for guests. The Dark Tower hosted poetry readings, literary discussions, art exhibitions, and musical performances. It was open several evenings a week and admission was free, though there was an expectation that guests would purchase food and drinks. Alelia hoped the Dark Tower would become self-sustaining, a permanent institution that would outlast her personal involvement. The Dark Tower was Alelia's most explicit statement about what she believed her wealth should accomplish. This wasn't about personal luxury, though she certainly enjoyed that. This was about creating infrastructure for black culture, providing the material support that artists need but rarely receive. It was about building an institution that would serve the Harlem Renaissance and ensure that black artists had a dedicated space for their work. The opening of the Dark Tower was celebrated in the black press and among Harlem intellectuals. It seemed to represent a new phase of the Harlem Renaissance, a moment when the movement was becoming institutionalized, when temporary gatherings in people's homes were being replaced by permanent cultural spaces. But the Dark Tower faced challenges from the beginning. The location, while central to Harlem, was in a residential building, which created conflicts with neighbors who complained about noise and crowds. The economics were difficult. Alelia had hoped the sale of food and drinks would cover operating costs, but attendance was inconsistent, and many guests couldn't afford to purchase much. Alelia subsidized the Dark Tower from her personal fortune, but this wasn't sustainable in the long term. There were also artistic and political tensions. Some artists felt the Dark Tower was too formal, too constrained by middle-class respectability. They preferred the more spontaneous gatherings in people's apartments, the rent parties where jazz musicians played and dancers improvised, and the atmosphere was loose and unpredictable. The Dark Tower, with its elegant decor and its literary focus, felt to some like an attempt to make black culture respectable for white consumption. Others criticized the Dark Tower for not being political enough. The Harlem Renaissance was occurring during a period of intense racial violence and oppression. Lynchings continued throughout the South, race riots destroyed black communities in northern cities, and legal segregation was enforced with brutal efficiency. Some black intellectuals argued that black artists had a responsibility to create work that advanced the political struggle for equality, that art should be a weapon in the fight against racism. A'Lelia didn't engage directly with these debates. She wasn't a theorist or a political activist. She simply created space and let artists use it as they saw fit. This hands-off approach frustrated some people who wanted her to take stronger positions or use her wealth more strategically for political purposes. Zora Neale Hurston, never one to mince words, called the young black artists and writers of the Harlem Renaissance the niggerati, a provocative term that captured both their intellectual ambitions and their outsider status. The term was partly affectionate, partly mocking. It acknowledged that these artists saw themselves as an intellectual elite, a black intelligentsia, while also recognizing that mainstream white society still saw them primarily as black people, subject to all the discrimination and violence that entailed. Many of the niggerati found refuge and support at A'Lelia's gatherings, where they could be brilliant, difficult, experimental, and unapologetically black, without having to perform respectability for white audiences or black elders who worried about the race's reputation. They could debate whether black art should serve political purposes or pursue aesthetic excellence for its own sake. They could argue about whether black artists should draw on African traditions or engage with European modernism. They could experiment with form and content without worrying about whether their work would confirm or challenge white stereotypes about black people. But A'Lelia's role as patron and facilitator was complicated, and not everyone appreciated what she was doing. Some black intellectuals criticized her as superficial, a woman who threw parties but didn't engage seriously with art or ideas. She didn't write poetry like Langston Hughes, didn't conduct anthropological research like Zora Neale Hurston, didn't produce scholarly work like W.E.B. Du Bois. What did she actually contribute? This criticism misunderstood something fundamental about how culture gets made. Artists need more than talent and inspiration. They need space, time, funding, and community. They need places to gather, opportunities to share work, and patrons who believe in them enough to provide material support. A'Lelia provided all of this, and in doing so, she made it possible for others to create the art we still celebrate today. The criticism also reflected gendered assumptions about what counts as important cultural work. Male patrons and philanthropists were celebrated for their financial support of the arts, but when A'Lelia did the same thing, she was dismissed as a dilettante. Male intellectuals who theorized about art and culture were taken seriously, but A'Lelia, who created the conditions for art and culture to flourish, was seen as frivolous. There was also tension around class and authenticity. A'Lelia moved easily between black and white worlds, between high society and bohemian artists, between European culture and African American vernacular traditions. Her wealth gave her access that most black people could never have, and some questioned whether she was really part of the black community, or simply a wealthy woman who happened to be black. This tension reflected larger debates within black intellectual circles about the talented 10th, W.E.B. Du Bois's concept that the most educated and accomplished black people had a responsibility to uplift the race. Du Bois argued that this elite group should lead the fight for racial equality, using their education and achievements to prove black capability to white America and to guide less educated black people toward progress. Some believed that black elites should focus on respectability and achievement that would prove black capability to white America. They should dress conservatively, speak proper English, avoid anything that might confirm white stereotypes, and demonstrate through their behavior that black people deserved equal treatment. This politics of respectability placed enormous pressure on prominent black people to be perfect representatives of their race. Others, like Zora Neale Hurston, celebrated black folk culture and rejected the idea that black people needed to prove anything to anyone. Hurston argued that black culture, The stories, music, language, and traditions of ordinary black people was valuable in itself, not because it demonstrated black capability to white people, but because it was authentic, creative, and beautiful. She resented the implication that rural black Southerners needed to be uplifted by educated elites, arguing that their culture was already rich and sophisticated in ways that educated people often failed to recognize. A'Lelia didn't fit neatly into either camp. She lived with extravagant luxury that seemed to flaunt wealth rather than use it for racial uplift in the ways that Du Bois and others advocated. She didn't focus on education, political organizing, or the kinds of institution building that were typically associated with racial progress. But she also created spaces where black culture could flourish on its own terms, without apology or accommodation to white expectations. Her parties mixed high culture and low culture, European sophistication and African American vernacular traditions, classical music and jazz, formal poetry and blues lyrics. This mixing troubled people who wanted clear boundaries between respectable culture and popular culture, between art that would impress white people and art that expressed authentic black experience. What made A'Lelia's lifestyle truly radical was that she lived as if Jim Crow didn't exist. She traveled in private rail cars, a luxury reserved for the wealthiest Americans. She employed white servants alongside black ones, reversing the usual racial hierarchy of domestic service. She wore fashions from Paris, collected European art, attended opera performances, and moved through the world with the confidence of someone who had never been told she didn't belong. Every champagne toast at Villa Lewaro was an act of defiance. Every party where black and white guests mingled as equals was a challenge to segregation. Every time A'Lelia walked into a room dressed in furs and jewels, she was making a statement. I am here, I am wealthy, I am powerful, and I will not make myself smaller to accommodate your discomfort. Her white neighbors in Irvington were openly hostile. They had not anticipated that a black family would move into their exclusive community, and they certainly hadn't expected that family to live in a mansion that dwarfed their own homes. There were complaints to local authorities about the noise from parties, about the number of cars parked on the street when A'Lelia entertained, about the presence of black guests in a white neighborhood. Some neighbors refused to acknowledge A'Lelia when they encountered her in town. Others made their disapproval clear through pointed comments and social snubs. There were incidents of vandalism at Villa Lewaro, though it was never clear whether these were random acts or deliberate expressions of racial hostility. The local press covered A'Lelia's activities with a mixture of fascination and disapproval, emphasizing her race and her extravagance in ways that suggested she was overstepping boundaries that should have constrained her. The white press coverage of A'Lelia oscillated between fascination and mockery. She was exotic, extravagant, excessive, always described in terms that emphasized her difference, her otherness. White journalists seemed unable to write about her without remarking on her race, her size. She was a tall, imposing woman nearly 6 feet tall, and her refusal to perform the deference they expected from black people. Articles about A'Lelia's parties often focused on the mixing of races, describing it in language that suggested something scandalous or inappropriate was occurring. The presence of white guests at black social events was treated as newsworthy, as if white people lowering themselves to socialize with black people on equal terms was inherently remarkable and possibly improper. But the black press was complicated too. Some newspapers and magazines celebrated her as proof of black achievement and capability. They published photographs of Villa Lewaro, described her parties in glowing terms, and presented her as evidence that black people could achieve the same level of wealth and sophistication as white people. A'Lelia was held up as a race woman, someone whose success reflected well on all black people. Others criticized her extravagance at a time when most black people were struggling with poverty, discrimination, and violence. Shouldn't she be using her wealth more responsibly? Shouldn't she be funding schools, supporting political organizations, or investing in businesses that would create jobs for black workers? Shouldn't she be more serious, more focused on racial uplift, more concerned with how her behavior reflected on the race? These criticisms reflected the impossible position of prominent black people in Jim Crow America. They were expected to represent their entire race, to be perfect ambassadors who would prove to white people that black people deserved equal treatment. Any failure, any scandal, any behavior that didn't conform to white middle-class respectability could be used as evidence that black people weren't ready for full citizenship. Individual white people were allowed to be individuals, Their behavior reflected only on themselves, not on their entire race. But black people, especially prominent black people, carried the weight of representation. Alelia's multiple divorces, her extravagant parties, her unconventional lifestyle, all of this was seen not just as personal choices but as reflections on black people's fitness for equality. Alelia rejected this burden. She lived for pleasure, for beauty, for joy, things that white people took for granted but that black people were supposed to defer until after they had achieved full equality. Her life asked a question that made many people uncomfortable. Why should black people wait to live fully? Why should black joy be postponed until white people decide we deserve it? This question was particularly pointed given the violence and oppression that characterized the 1920s. The decade is often remembered as the Roaring Twenties, a time of prosperity, cultural innovation, and social liberation. But for black Americans, the 20s were also a time of intense racial violence. Lynchings continued throughout the South, with black people murdered by white mobs for alleged crimes, or simply for violating racial etiquette. The Ku Klux Klan experienced a resurgence, growing to millions of members and exercising political power, not just in the South but in northern and western states as well. Race riots destroyed black communities in multiple cities. In 1921, a white mob attacked the Greenwood district of Tulsa, Oklahoma, a prosperous black neighborhood known as Black Wall Street. Over the course of 2 days, white rioters burned 35 blocks, destroyed more than 1,200 homes and businesses, and killed an estimated 300 black people. Similar violence occurred in other cities, with white mobs attacking black neighborhoods and black people defending themselves as best they could. Legal segregation was enforced with brutal efficiency. Jim Crow laws mandated separate facilities for black and white people, separate schools, separate restaurants, separate water fountains, separate sections on trains and buses. These laws were backed by violence, with black people who challenged segregation risking arrest, beating, or death. In this context, Alelia's insistence on living luxuriously, on claiming pleasure and beauty and joy, was itself a form of resistance. She refused to defer her own happiness until black people achieved full equality. She refused to live in a state of constant struggle and seriousness. She claimed the right to enjoy her wealth, to throw parties, to surround herself with beautiful things and interesting people, the same rights that white wealthy people exercised without question or criticism. The 1920s were Alelia's peak years, a time when her wealth, her social position, and the cultural energy of the Harlem Renaissance aligned to make her one of the most influential figures in black cultural life. Villa Lawaro was at its most magnificent. Her Harlem townhouse was the center of artistic activity, and the Dark Tower represented the institutionalization of her patronage. But the decade that had roared so loudly ended with a crash that devastated black communities even more severely than white ones. The stock market collapse of October 1929 triggered the Great Depression, an economic catastrophe that destroyed businesses, eliminated jobs, and wiped out savings across the country. Banks failed, taking depositors' money with them. Businesses closed, throwing millions of people out of work. The unemployment rate soared to 25% nationally, but for black workers it was much higher. In some cities, more than half of black workers were unemployed. Black businesses and black workers, who had always operated on the margins of the American economy, were hit first and hardest. The principle of last hired, first fired meant that black workers lost their jobs before white workers. Black businesses, which often served primarily black customers who now had no money to spend, failed at higher rates than white-owned businesses. The Walker Company struggled as customers who had once bought hair care products regularly found themselves unable to afford anything beyond basic necessities. Sales declined sharply, profits evaporated, and the business empire that Madam C.J. Walker had built began to crumble. The company survived the Depression, but it never regained its former prominence or profitability. Alelia's personal fortune, which had seemed inexhaustible during the prosperous 20s, dwindled rapidly. She had invested in stocks that became worthless after the crash. She had extended credit to friends and artists who now couldn't repay her. She had maintained an expensive lifestyle, multiple residences, servants, travel, entertaining, that was unsustainable once her income declined. Villa Lawaro, that magnificent symbol of black achievement, became a financial burden. The mansion required constant maintenance. The roof needed repairs. The plumbing and heating systems needed updating. The grounds needed care. A full staff was necessary to maintain the property, and their salaries had to be paid even as Alelia's income declined. Property taxes on the estate were substantial, and Alelia struggled to pay them. She tried to sell Villa Lewaro, but in the depths of the Depression, there were no buyers for a luxury estate. She tried to rent it, but few people could afford the rent for such a large property, and those who could afford it were often white people who didn't want to rent from a black owner or live in a house associated with black people. The mansion stood increasingly empty, a monument to a prosperity that had vanished almost overnight. Alelia continued to live primarily in her Harlem townhouse, visiting Villa Lewaro occasionally but unable to maintain it as she once had. The Dark Tower, which had only been open for 2 years, closed in 1928, before the Depression even began. The salon had never been financially sustainable. Alelia had subsidized it from her personal fortune, covering the difference between operating costs and revenue from food and drink sales. As her financial situation became more precarious, she couldn't justify the expense. The closing of the Dark Tower symbolized something larger than one woman's financial troubles. It demonstrated how fragile black cultural institutions were, how dependent on individual wealth and patronage, how vulnerable to economic shifts that could destroy in months what had taken years to build. White cultural institutions, museums, symphony orchestras, theaters, had endowments, boards of wealthy donors, and institutional structures that could survive economic downturns. Black cultural institutions often depended on one or two wealthy individuals, and when those individuals faced financial problems, the institutions collapsed. Alelia's vibrant world, once seemingly boundless, began to contract dramatically in the late 1920s. Her health, already under strain from years of relentless socializing and the immense pressures of her unique position, deteriorated significantly. She suffered from what was likely severe hypertension, a condition poorly understood and inadequately treated at the time, and may have experienced a series of minor strokes that gradually eroded her formidable energy and vitality. The economic storm of the Great Depression, unleashed by the 1929 stock market crash, swept away the financial foundations of her life with brutal efficiency. The Madam C.J. Walker Manufacturing Company, her mother's pioneering legacy, saw its sales plummet as its primary customer base, black women, disproportionately affected by widespread job losses and deepening poverty, could no longer afford even essential hair care products. Alelia's personal fortune, once vast and seemingly inexhaustible, dwindled rapidly. Her investments collapsed, and her income streams from the struggling company dried up. Villa Lewaro, the magnificent symbol of black achievement and aspiration, transformed from a source of immense pride into an unbearable financial burden. Its exorbitant maintenance costs, substantial property taxes, and the salaries of its necessary staff became impossible to sustain. Her desperate attempts to sell or even rent the sprawling mansion in the depths of the Depression proved utterly futile. There were simply no buyers for such a grand estate, especially one owned by a black woman in that economic climate. Even her beloved Dark Tower, the vibrant Harlem salon that had nurtured so much black creativity, had been forced to close its doors in 1928, a year before the crash, a stark and early testament to the inherent fragility of black cultural institutions so reliant on individual wealth and patronage. Despite being constantly surrounded by people at her legendary gatherings, Alelia often felt a profound loneliness. Her multiple marriages had all ended, leaving her without a steadfast life partner, and her relationship with her adopted daughter, May, was fraught with the complexities of their shared, yet often conflicting legacies and the immense expectations placed upon them. On August 16, 1931, Alelia Walker died at a friend's home in Long Branch, New Jersey, where she had sought respite and recovery. She was only 46 years old. The cause was likely a cerebral hemorrhage or heart attack, the tragic culmination of untreated hypertension and the immense stress of her final years. Her funeral at St. Philip's Episcopal Church in Harlem was an event of profound significance, one of the largest the neighborhood had ever witnessed. Thousands of mourners, both famous and ordinary, filled the church and spilled out onto the streets. Among the prominent figures paying their respects were literary giants Langston Hughes and Count T. Cullen, alongside influential educator and activist Mary McLeod Bethune. Reverend Adam Clayton Powell Sr., a towering figure in Harlem's religious and political life, presided over the solemn service. The funeral was more than just a farewell to Alelia. It was a collective mourning for the fading Harlem Renaissance itself. The cultural explosion of the 20s, for all its brilliance, had not translated into the fundamental political or economic progress that most black people desperately needed, leaving a lingering sense of unfulfilled promise as the Depression deepened its grip. With Alelia's passing, a curious and profoundly tragic phenomenon began, her rapid disappearance from the annals of American history, while her mother, Madam C.J. Walker, remained a celebrated and enduring figure, her extraordinary rags-to-riches story perfectly fitting the aspirational American narrative of self-made success. Alelia's own significant legacy was systematically minimized, then largely forgotten. Madam Walker's narrative served a powerful purpose, demonstrating that sheer hard work and entrepreneurial spirit could overcome even the most formidable racial barriers, a comforting tale for a nation grappling with its own deep-seated racial contradictions. Alelia, however, defied such easy categorization. She was an heiress, not a self-made entrepreneur, a flamboyant patron of the arts, not a political activist or an educator in the traditional sense. Her life of inherited wealth, extravagant parties, and unapologetic self-expression simply did not align with the carefully constructed narratives that mid-20th century America, both white and black, wished to tell about progress and respectability. White historians, when they acknowledged black history at all, tended to focus on figures who fit familiar, digestible categories, the educators like Booker T. Washington, the civil rights activists like W.E.B. Du Bois, or the scientists like George Washington Carver. Alelia, with her unconventional lifestyle and primary focus on cultural celebration rather than overt political struggle, did not fit this mold. Similarly, during the burgeoning civil rights era, black historians often prioritized stories of struggle, resistance, and tangible achievement that could inspire and mobilize the masses. Alelia's story, with its emphasis on personal pleasure and artistic patronage, was deemed less politically useful, even potentially problematic given her unconventional lifestyle, multiple marriages, and rumored relationships that challenged prevailing social norms. She was thus reduced to a footnote, a colorful but ultimately minor character in the grander, more serious narrative of the Harlem Renaissance. Villa Lewaro, her magnificent home, suffered a parallel and equally poignant fate. Sold in 1932 to a Catholic religious order, it was converted into a retirement home for nuns, its original purpose and profound significance obscured. Later abandoned, it fell into severe disrepair, a decaying monument to a forgotten past. It was only in the 1990s, thanks to the vision and dedication of Harold and Helena Doley, a black investment banker and his wife, that Villa Lewaro was painstakingly restored to its former glory. Today it stands as a national historic landmark, a powerful, tangible testament to what was built and nearly lost entirely. Despite the pervasive historical amnesia, Alelia Walker's true legacy is both profound and revolutionary, resonating deeply even today. In an America steeped in violent oppression, a nation marked by rampant lynching, devastating race riots, and pervasive legal segregation, she dared to create safe, vibrant spaces where black people could simply be, could thrive, and could express themselves without constant fear. Villa Lewaro, her elegant Harlem townhouse, and the iconic Dark Tower were far more than just venues for extravagant parties. They were sanctuaries, cultural laboratories where black artists, intellectuals, and socialites could gather, free from the relentless scrutiny and judgment of the white gaze. It was within these hallowed spaces that figures like Langston Hughes found not only community, but also the vital inspiration for his groundbreaking poetry, where Zora Neale Hurston honed her unique voice and developed her pioneering anthropological insights, and where Countee Cullen, Aaron Douglas, and Wallace Thurman, among countless others, found the crucial support and encouragement to create their indelible work. The question therefore lingers: would the Harlem Renaissance, as we know it, have flourished with the same unparalleled vibrancy and produced such a rich tapestry of art without her unique and audacious patronage? History, in its often biased recounting, frequently remembers the artists, the creators, but far too often overlooks or actively forgets the patrons and facilitators who provide the essential conditions for art to thrive. This gendered erasure is particularly stark. Male patrons like Andrew Carnegie or J.P. Morgan are universally lauded as philanthropists, their names etched onto countless institutions, while women performing similar roles are frequently dismissed as mere dilettantes, their contributions trivialized. For a black woman, this erasure was even more complete, compounded by racial prejudice. We have been conditioned not to value the creation of space, the facilitation of community, or the provision of material support when it emanates from a black woman. Crucially, we have been taught not to value pleasure, joy, and beauty when claimed by those not supposed to have access to them, particularly black women. Alelia's extravagant lifestyle, far from being frivolous, was an act of radical, defiant resistance. She steadfastly refused to defer her own happiness, her own inherent right to luxury and self-expression, until black people achieved full equality. White people of her era took pleasure and comfort as their unquestioned birthright. Alelia claimed the very same, thereby challenging the fundamental assumption of white supremacy that black people exist only to serve, to struggle, to prove their worth, never simply to live, to enjoy, to exist for their own sake. Her model remains profoundly relevant today, as we continue to grapple with the policing of black joy, the scrutiny of black wealth, and the constant questioning of black visibility and self-determination. She used her inherited wealth to create beauty, foster community, and carve out essential space for black creativity, living unapologetically and claiming luxury as her inherent right. Today, Villa Lawaro still stands majestically in Irvington, New York, its limestone facade gleaming after decades of meticulous restoration. If one stands outside its imposing gates, gazing up at those 34 rooms, at the architectural grandeur so thoughtfully designed by Vertner Tandy, it is possible to vividly imagine what it was like in the 1920s. The windows ablaze with light, the intoxicating sounds of jazz and laughter spilling out into the night, and inside, a vibrant tapestry of black artists and intellectuals gathered, creating, arguing, celebrating, simply existing without apology in a world that denied their very humanity. That vibrant, audacious world is gone now. The Harlem Renaissance eventually ended. The Great Depression tragically destroyed its economic foundations, and the remarkable people who lived through it have long since passed. Yet what they built, the art, the literature, the music, the profound ideas, profoundly shaped American culture in ways we are still discovering and appreciating. And at the very center of it all, largely forgotten but absolutely essential to its flourishing, was Alelia Walker, the hidden heiress of Harlem. She lived as if segregation didn't apply to her. She created indispensable spaces where black people could be authentically themselves, and she insisted on joy, on beauty, on pleasure, on living luxuriously in a world that desperately wanted her to be invisible. For this audacious defiance, for this radical act of self-possession, history tried to erase her. But we remember now. We understand now what she contributed, what she made possible, and what she truly represented. Alelia Walker was here. She mattered. She changed American culture in ways that reverberate to this day, and we will not forget her again.